The first major talk I gave on this was at a conference called The Next Web in Amsterdam in 2017. But what I noticed is there were critique from two sides. One was the critique from people in typical business, corporate business, which is, why would I want to do an illegal drug? Hippies do that, ravers do that, we don't do that. And the other framing was from like the deep psychedelic crowd, which is, you can't just make psychedelics and LSD another tool for the man. You know, you're just helping capitalism get better, man.
Welcome to This Anthro Life, a podcast inspired by the curious and remarkably human ways that we shape and are shaped by the world around us. I'm your host, Adam Gamwell. Today, we're diving into a topic that's both ancient and on the cusp of a cultural revolution. It's the use and understanding of psychedelics. Our society is at a fascinating juncture with these powerful substances emerging from decades of stigma into a period of exploration and reevaluation, framed not just within the context of counterculture, but in mainstream conversations about health, wellness, and even productivity. Joining me is Paul F. Austin, a pioneer in the psychedelic space and the founder of Third Wave. He'll be here to discuss the evolution and implications of, well, this third wave of psychedelics. We'll wade into the layers of psychedelic history, from indigenous practices to the counterculture of the 60s, and look at how psychedelics are being reintegrated into the modern world, not only through the lens of personal growth and mental health, but as a tool for leaders and innovators in business as well. How can substances like LSD or acid and psilocybin taken in microdoses help enhance creativity, productivity, and personal insight? And what does it mean for our society's approach to wellness, leadership, and even the stigmas around getting high? With Paul's insights, we'll explore the intersection of psychedelics within culture, science, and technology, highlighting the shift from underground to mainstream and what this means for future generations. So whether you're an enthusiast, a skeptic, or simply curious, this conversation will enlighten, challenge, and inspire as we navigate the complex landscape of psychedelics together. So tune in as we journey through the mind, culture, and potential future of psychedelics with Paul F. Austin here on This Anthro Life. Really excited to have you on the podcast today, Paul. And I've been following your work for a while, both in terms of microdosing and psychedelics, and also your work at Third Wave. So I just want to kick off first by saying thanks for being on the program with me.
Thanks for having me on, Adam. I'm stoked to talk about psychedelics and microdosing for your audience through This Anthro Life.
So just kind of to open us up, you know, one of the things I kind of like to do with guests is kind of their superhero origin story, as it were, right? And I appreciated your tale, and I'd love to kind of get, you kind of walk us through a little bit about this, how you found yourself both interested in psychedelics and the power of them, and then also how that led to you kind of working through Third Wave and kind of offering a lot of educational resources and trainings and things like that.
I'll do my best to contextualize this within a reasonably brief period of time. And part of this story is also in that book, Mastering Microdosing, which I think you had a chance to read through at least some of. And the crux of it is, I was raised in a very, I would say, traditional Midwest house. My parents, who are still married and actually still live in the house that I was raised in, are both from Grand Rapids, and they raised myself and my two sisters there. And growing up, I grew up in a reasonably sheltered environment. Church every Sunday. I couldn't watch, for example, rated R movies. My parents were very against me drinking alcohol before the age of 21, right? It was very sort of strict in that way. And at the age of 16, I was a more independent-minded kid. I did what I wanted to do. I wasn't overly, quote unquote, I didn't get in trouble necessarily with school or the law, but I definitely was a bit of a black sheep. And so at the age of 16, my parents found out that I had been smoking cannabis with a friend, and they sat me down one Sunday after church, and my dad looked at me, and my dad's a very kind, sweet man, and we have a great relationship. But he looked at me and he said, I haven't been this disappointed since my brother passed away in a car accident 30 years ago, which just shows you the sort of lens that they were coming into illegal drugs with. These are very harmful. These are very dangerous. In no situation whatsoever should you be touching them. And yet the personal experience that I had with cannabis was, I had a ton of fun. I laughed for hours and hours. It was a really great way to sort of connect with friends at that point in time, because I was 16. I was trying to figure out who I was and how I fit in. And alcohol wasn't really something that I was all that interested in. In fact, I smoked cannabis before I ever drank alcohol. And so after that experience, it really left me with this impression of interesting. Like, my parents clearly don't have the same context that I do, which is unfortunate. And if I want to continue to explore how I want to explore, I'm going to have to keep this aspect of my life quite private. And so the same friend who introduced me to cannabis a few years later introduced me to mushrooms. I was 19 at the time. Had a pretty interesting experience, but a few months after that did LSD for the first time at a high dose and had this really breakthrough, transcendent, magnificent experience where I felt connected to everything. It was really like a before acid and after acid experience. And from that experience, it really inspired me to not live in any conventional way, to sort of get out of the more traditional, contained shelter environment that I had been raised in, and really go explore life at its outer edges. So soon after university, like a few weeks after graduating, I moved to Turkey, where I taught English. And then that eventually led me to becoming a digital nomad, traveling in many countries. And as part of that path, I ended up in Budapest in 2015. Had heard about microdosing, had started to experiment with microdosing a little bit, and was with a couple friends doing a higher dose of LSD again. And we were just reflecting on the current state of psychedelics at that point in time. Joe Rogan and Tim Ferriss and Sam Harris were starting to talk about psychedelics. Johns Hopkins and NYU was starting to publish clinical research. And then cannabis was becoming more and more accepted. And so at that point in time, we thought, I think this could be a really great opportunity to start to educate a broader populace about the benefits and risks of psychedelics from a very objective scientific lens. And so I started Third Wave at that point in time. And then soon after that, not soon after that, actually, a few years after that, just to sort of finish the story and bring it full circle, I had started to educate my parents as well about psychedelics. And my mom was always a little bit more skeptical and hesitant, but my dad had a tendency to be more open-minded. And so when Michael Pollan published his book, How to Change Your Mind, in 2018, we sent him that book. He read it, started to microdose, and then about a year after that, I actually guided him through a high-dose psilocybin mushroom journey or experience. And so that to me spoke to the power of, he went from being, as I mentioned at the beginning of the story, incredibly disappointed to the point of, almost horror, to actually being open to experience this firsthand. And I think that speaks to the power of when we work with psychedelics and we do this work ourselves, rather than just talking about it, that sort of model of what we represent and create can really help to influence people who are close to us, because a lot of us focus so much on, and I speak for myself as well, kind of the big picture. But at the end of the day, it's really about how can we influence our close friends and family to be a little healthier and a little bit more balanced.
No, that's great. No, thank you for sharing that. And that's very cool that you're able to kind of like literally bring that full circle and bring that conversation back to your family too. Because I agree. It's funny. It seemed like that you're right. Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind was like a big watershed moment for a lot of folks, because he was the more comfortable, plant food reader that folks were used to hearing from. And then I was pleasantly surprised when I saw that was going to be his next book on how to change your mind, right? And This Is Your Mind on Plants after that too. It was interesting to kind of see that conversation come more into the mainstream in that space. For a different population, right? I think, as you said, kind of like there's the Tim Ferriss, Joe Rogan audience, then there was the Michael Pollan audience, and they kind of found their way.
Which are very different.
Very different, right?
And Michael Pollan talked about how, he was someone in his mid-50s. He had done mushrooms, I think, a couple times in his 20s, but hadn't really explored the space. And so he went and, his style of journalism is, just go and do all of this firsthand. And so he really turned on an audience of people in their 50s and 60s who were kind of at that midlife doldrum and wanted to really reinvigorate or revitalize it. And it's been, it's the Michael Pollan effect, as we all know. It's been fascinating to see since 2018, the billions of dollars that's been invested, the legislation that's been passed. And now we're sitting at a point in time where actually more people support psychedelics than don't, which is a massive shift in, just 9 years since I started Third Wave in 2015. It's been great to see.
Yeah, I think it's such an exciting time also for that too. I think it was last year. I was at a screening for a film, and I was talking about the power of psychedelic assisted therapy, and Rick Doblin from MAPS was there and talking a bit about some of the MDMA clinical 3 trials that they're doing now around that, and kind of supporting bringing more psychedelics into therapeutic spaces. And we've seen like ketamine is already being used in certain places. MDMA is probably on the heels soon. And we'll see that, I think, similar for psilocybin and maybe even LSD one day, But I'm curious, like, because one of the big shifts that we've seen there, right, is in kind of your story encapsulates this also, that there's, for folks that haven't tried psychedelics or microdosing even, like there's a lot of fear that we know that's hung over from both the war on drugs in the 70s and 80s, but then beyond that, just this lack of familiarity. So I'm kind of curious in your perspective, like, have you seen a shift in terms of things that people kind of have wrong about psychedelics if they've never tried them or haven't really had a lot of conversations, and what some of those things are? So in case folks are like, well, I don't know about that, like, what do people kind of have these like incorrect assumptions kind of baked in from the culture that you find?
Well, it's interesting because I've been talking about this for probably since 2016, 2017 regarding psychedelics. And back at that point in time, I really felt like I was speaking to the majority of individuals. And now I really feel like I'm speaking more to the minority of folks, just because there's been such a phenomenal job done in destigmatizing these substances. I would say the most prevalent ones are that because this is an illegal drug, it must be addictive and harmful. Because that's the case for most illegal drugs, heroin and cocaine and crystal meth. And, you even look at something like cannabis, has a tendency to be more addictive or sort of like an alcohol replacement. And in fact, psychedelics are anti-addictive. That clinical research shows how powerful they can be to interrupt patterns of addiction and help people heal from alcoholism and other forms of addiction. So I think that's normally the first one. I think the second one is, individuals are just getting high from this, and usually what I reflect back when that's a, perspective or objection is altering our consciousness it's like an evolutionary mandate almost that we as humans have been altering our consciousness for thousands and thousands of years, and that the most common way that we've altered our consciousness, especially over the last 300 years, has been through alcohol, specifically. And if you look at psychedelics compared to alcohol, they're much safer. They're much less toxic on the body and the liver. They have a lot of medical benefits that alcohol doesn't necessarily have. And that's not to denigrate alcohol, or that's not to say you should never drink, because the context of when we consume alcohol is often different than the context in which we consume psychedelics. But it is to say that altering our consciousness is a very natural impulse, and that a lot of people are, finding, I would say, health in becoming what's commonly called Cali sober now, where they're giving up alcohol and they're exploring different forms of, substances to help alter their consciousness. So yes, we're getting high, if you will, but that's preferable to getting to blacking out on something like alcohol. And I think the third thing, which has become more and more relevant, especially as more individuals are working with psychedelics, is that there can be a level of dependence on them. And I think that's true for anything that is external to us, or even something like meditation or breath work, that we can become overly fixated or attached on this endogenous substance to say, okay, the only way I can feel good, the only way that I can, navigate life is if I'm doing ayahuasca every week, or if I'm, microdosing 4 times a week, or if I, do a journey with mushrooms every month. And so there can be a tendency, especially for people who are quite new to psychedelics, to overdo it. And not focus as much on what we call integration, which is, okay, after you've had this aha or these insights, how do you then take those quote unquote downloads and actually integrate them into your everyday existence, so you aren't necessarily dependent on a psychedelic to feel that way, but you can feel great regardless of that. And that way psychedelics become more of a special treat. The metaphor that I love to use is like going to the dentist. That every 6 months we go and we get a deep clean from the dentist, but every day we brush our teeth and we floss. And I think our relationship with psychedelics is similar, that every day we need to have a practice like meditation or breath or journaling or whatever that is. And then every so often, it might be nice to get a deep spiritual cleanse by working with ayahuasca or a high dose of psilocybin or whatever that might be.
I love that. That's a really great way to kind of reframe some thinking, and that it isn't. And if anybody has tried ayahuasca, you're not going to want to take that every weekend anyway. But to your good point, or even like high dose of psilocybin. But I think that's a really important way to kind of think about that. It's also like psychedelics work really well in concert with a lifestyle, right? And that don't mean like living in a van traveling down the road necessarily, but just like the idea of, right, that you have a meditation or a breath practice, you have a form of journaling or some way of being reflective or mindfulness, as a kind of a place and a part with that, versus as something that's always kind of separate. And I think that this is kind of an interesting way to connect different kind of cultural practices, So I'm gonna jump timescales here because I'm curious your thought on this too. That obviously the other piece of this too is that I think if people are either unaware or maybe more fearful of psychedelics because they've only heard about them in a legal context, they're not really aware that they've been around for thousands. I mean, beyond the time that humans even used them, millions of years. But they're many plants that a lot of them come from in different plant medicines. And so I'm just curious, that what inspired your work? Because I know you talk a bit about some of the history in more ancient uses of psychedelics in mastering microdosing, which I appreciate as an anthropologist, but also just as a history nerd. That was cool to kind of think about other areas and places that we've seen this before. And just for a little bit of context too, so I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, and I did my research in southern Peru. I was actually working with agrobiodiversity farming in quinoa. Cool. However, I just ended up hanging out with some ayahuasca shamans and learning a lot about that plant medicine as well, experientially and just talking about it with people. And it was a profound way to kind of fall into the ways that culture plays into how we experience medicines, and the other point you're saying here too, where it's not just this thing that just is by itself, but it's actually integrated throughout one's life and also one's cultural practice. So, right. Without derailing my question, I'm curious, other like historical areas that you've explored too. Keep going in that space, and how that kind of inspired your thinking with psychedelics and microdosing.
And just to touch on the ayahuasca piece, Jeremy Narby, who you may know of, has written extensively about this in terms of how does especially the indigenous practice with ayahuasca, how is that influenced by the language of the Shipibo and the Quechua, and how is that influenced by the context and the set and setting? So I think that's all fascinating things, and it relates even to psychedelics, let's say in the West. So as a brief history kind of lesson or perspective, the name Third Wave, which is the sort of brand or platform that I've built over the last several years, suggests that there's obviously a first wave and a second wave. And so what I usually contextualize it is the first wave was the ancient and indigenous use of psychedelic substances for thousands of years. And then the second wave was the counterculture in the 50s and 60s when it came back sort of on the scene. So if we look at the, let's say, ancient use of psychedelics, and I use those two words intentionally. Ancient, I would characterize more as the ancient Greek use of psychedelics, as well as the use of psychedelics in ancient India in particular. So in the Vedantic scriptures, there's something called soma that is written about, and the hypothesis is that soma was made from psilocybin mushrooms. Additionally, in ancient Greece, there were these mysteries called the Eleusinian mysteries that individuals like Plato and Aristotle and Marcus Aurelius participated in. And as part of those Eleusinian mysteries, they drank a beverage called koukion, which is made from ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, the same fungus that LSD is synthesized from. And so there's a very distinct relationship between the ancient Greek use of psychedelics and the reintroduction of psychedelics into the West. Now, even prior to that, there was, and this comes from Terence McKenna, he had a theory called the stoned ape hypothesis, more of a hypothesis than a theory, which was that our ancient ancestors consumed psilocybin mushrooms tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago on the savannas of Africa, because these low doses of psilocybin mushrooms help to improve visual acuity. And so if you can see better, then you can hunt better, then you have a higher likelihood of surviving. McKenna also says that high doses of psilocybin were supposedly responsible for early cave art, the sort of human preoccupation with spirituality and religion, maybe 30 or 40,000 years ago. Now, again, this is very much a hypothesis. I don't think there's any necessarily hard evidence. It'd be hard to establish that, but it is an interesting thought process that, we've been using these substances for thousands of years. And the reason I mention all of that, if we're to bring this into a more modern time, is it's only in the last 60 years now that quote unquote Western culture, which is now really global culture in many ways, has been exposed to psychedelics. That when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the early 4th century, they cut off these Eleusinian mysteries and they said no more of it. And so for 1700 years, we as a Western culture have had no relationship with psychedelics whatsoever. And so the reason, part of my hypothesis in terms of why did the counterculture go sideways? Well, this was the first time that we really had a chance to work with psychedelics in 1700 years. We're like, kind of babies trying to walk for the first time again. And so because the emphasis was on very high doses of LSD, turn on, tune in, drop out, there wasn't a strong enough cultural container to hold the sort of power of all of that acid, basically. And so that's why in 2015, when I started Third Wave, I was like, instead of focusing on high doses of LSD, let's focus on very low doses of LSD and psilocybin mushrooms as a way to bridge that gap. And that way, folks who are pretty new to psychedelics, instead of having to jump in the deep end right away and potentially experience paranoia, anxiety, a challenging trip, potentially even a traumatizing trip, they can actually sort of easily kind of wade their way in to these deeper aspects of consciousness by starting with a microdose or a low dose, seeing how that feels, and then going, oh, I like that. How can I continue to explore this from a very intentional and responsible perspective?
Yeah, and I think that's great. And I think it is such interesting to kind of recognize that as we trace through history, right, there's been different ways that we've experienced these different substances. And then to your point that we can also think about the amount as part of it. That's an important part, right? Whether you're taking kind of a heroic dose of, what was the Terence kind of said, you take 5 grams of dried mushrooms in complete darkness, and if you want to talk to God, that, or,
silence, no music. Right? Yeah. Just
you in that, and or enter to your point of like, can it be a bit more gentle? I remember a colleague of mine, I think it was my last day when I was in Peru in 2016. And we were looking at some Wachuma or San Pedro, and he's like, when we think about these plant medicines, it's like, why do we have to have our ass kicked by a dose sometimes? Couldn't we just have a gentle learning? And that was the first time that I heard someone inadvertently talk about microdosing in that regard. It's something that I kind of learned about at that time too. And I thought I was like, it's a really interesting idea, right? And then it was like, okay, then how much does one take in order to actually have an experience, but not, either trip or not have too much to be able to kind of function or walk around town. And that was an interesting moment, because as we think about that, and I think you're right too, that as psychedelics find their ways in a bit more mainstream conversations, and even in perhaps soon, I think at some point mainstream culture, especially, it's going to enter through the therapeutic aspect, I think. And also I want to talk with you about leadership. I think that's another way we're going to see it come in. We realize that there's different ways that we can engage that in sort of amounts. So I'm curious your thoughts about this too, because that seems like one of the really interesting things that Third Wave does, is that you offer a lot of education around the idea of microdosing. And obviously, your new book, Mastering Microdosing, also is framed around this. And that was actually really helpful to be able to both put some numbers to things, but then get a sense of like, why and when would I take, what would I take? And so part of it, like maybe we can take LSD and psilocybin as 2 examples that you talk about a lot in the book, as we think about why would I choose one of those 2? And then what does a microdose look like, as part of that process or protocol? So you can pick either one, or we can go through both of them. I'm just kind of curious, like, and as you talk about this, like, how do we understand what I should even take, and in what context, and like, what might it do, and what might that protocol look like?
Yeah, great question. So the sort of phenomenon of microdosing is somewhat nascent. That it really started in 2011 when Dr. Jim Fadiman published a book called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. And one of those chapters was dedicated to the practice of microdosing. He essentially collected a number of anecdotal reports of people who had tried microdosing, both LSD and psilocybin, and published those anecdotal reports about what they experienced. He was then on the Tim Ferriss podcast in 2015, and that's when microdosing really started to become more of a thing. It's when I first learned about it. And from that, I then published or started Third Wave and started publishing content, educational content around it. So the idea of microdosing is that it's a protocol. So it's not just let's eat a stem and see what happens. It's really a protocol of doing it 2 or 3 times per week, depending on the protocol, for a period of 30 to 60 days, sometimes as long as 90 days, with a core intention for that extended period of time. So the parallel that I usually draw is like mindfulness meditation. If you're new to meditating and you sit down on the cushion and you meditate for 15 minutes and you expect to be enlightened that day, you're going to be disappointed because it usually requires showing up at least for 30 days straight, sitting for 15 or 20 minutes on the cushion before you start really to experience some of those tangible benefits from mindfulness meditation. And microdosing is similar, that a lot of people who are coming to microdosing are, I would say there's like 2 main categories. You have a lot of folks who have been on certain psychiatric medications, most commonly SSRIs or medication for ADHD, that either is no longer working or has a lot of nasty side effects, and they're looking to microdosing to almost as a replacement for those psychiatric medications. And then you also have individuals who, just are looking almost for like a performance enhancer, to be a little bit more creative, to spend more time in flow, to be a little bit more relational, connected, open in that way. And obviously there's overlap between those two. So when we look then at, which substance someone might choose, typically the way that I contextualize that is if you're interested in weaning off SSRIs, for example, or just doing deeper emotional processing, microdosing psilocybin is really useful for that. And a typical microdose for psilocybin is anywhere from 50 milligrams to 250 milligrams. And it depends on a lot of factors, but the main variables that dictate that are if you have a previous history of SSRI use and your age. Most people need about 100 milligrams as a microdose for psilocybin. LSD is anywhere, I would say, from 5 micrograms to 25 micrograms. And again, this is determined by age and if you have a previous history of SSRI use. And the reason for that is having a history of SSRI use blunts your response. You're less sensitive. And so typically people need a higher dose amount to experience the same benefits as someone who, would take much less and doesn't necessarily have that history. So it's about 1/10 of a regular dose is the way that I contextualize it. And then the core difference between LSD and psilocybin is LSD is more dopamine. And so dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is tied to focus, attention, and motivation, whereas psilocybin is more serotonin. And serotonin is tied to sort of contentment, presence, and somatics, the experience of being more in touch with our body. And so those who are interested in productivity, flow, creativity, even cognitive enhancement, typically are more drawn to LSD because it can help with that state of focus, attention, and motivation. So someone who's more cerebral might resonate more with LSD. Whereas someone who is, like I mentioned before, attempting to get off SSRIs, they may be in a therapeutic container and looking for support. They may just want to better understand their sort of emotions and how to navigate it. Psilocybin tends to be the more common one. And kind of as a brief anecdote of this, when I was 28 and living in New York City, I was going through a very stressful period of time and started to see a therapist for the first time and was in that therapeutic container for about 6 months, every week, more or less. And on that first day with the therapist, she said, look, if you want to microdose before these these sessions, feel, you're more than welcome to. So before every session with a therapist, I would take about 200 milligrams of psilocybin, and I just noticed that these emotions that tend to be, I would tend to repress or be beneath the surface, would just come online. I could release, anger a little bit better, or sadness, or grief, or whatever needed to come up. It was just a little bit easier to process overall. So that's like psilocybin, more therapeutic, LSD more about cognitive enhancement and performance. And then the final thing that I usually contextualize within this is, if someone is listening to this and they're on psychiatric medications and they're looking to microdosing or psychedelics as a potential alternative, what I always emphasize is to do so under the guidance of a medical professional, whether that's a nurse psychiatrist or a psychiatrist, that having that professional support is really helpful, because it's not necessarily all rainbows and butterflies, as many folks know who have tried to titrate off certain medications. And it's really important that it's done with someone who can medically support you in that process.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Thanks for adding that there at the end too, because it is, we're not giving medical advice here, but like it's an important point to recognize that, like, these are conversations that we can have with our healthcare professionals, right?
Especially now more so than ever, right? Like when I was having these conversations 6-7 years ago, people were like, I can't talk to my psychiatrist about this. He's going to think, or she's going to think I'm nuts. And now I would say the majority of psychiatrists at least have an awareness or know about this, even if they personally aren't experienced with psychedelics.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I'm curious, like in your perspective and your work too, like why have you seen, or why do you believe that microdosing has become much more popular in conversations now? Like we got Jim Fadiman's podcast and a couple more big conversations happening with Michael Pollan too. But like, what else is going on in culture that you've seen that's like shifting that conversation?
It's a great question. So I think the number one thing is the ineffectiveness of conventional psychiatric medications. There's been recent research published on SSRIs that have shown that they're no more useful than a placebo. And so placebo and SSRIs work about 40% of the time. Wow. And then if you look at Ritalin and Adderall, they help, but they also come with a lot of negative side effects. So I think people are just tired of the conventional psychiatric medications. As we all know, there is a quote unquote mental health crisis. That mental health crisis became worse as a result of the pandemic and everything that happened from COVID. So I think number one, people are really looking for medicine that is more effective. And a lot of people are naturally finding that microdosing is more effective than a lot of these conventional psychiatric medications. I think the second reason is we're also seeing the growth and development of what I would call the sort of biohacking, optimization, self-actualization focus in a lot, especially in tech and entrepreneurial culture, that there is this desire to become gods ourselves, which is a whole another metaphysical and philosophical conversation, and that we are looking for tools and techniques and technologies that help to facilitate a sense of creativity, power, efficacy, and that microdosing, especially microdosing LSD, a lot of people have framed it as this sort of limitless pill, that when we take these low doses of LSD, we're better skiers and snowboarders. We can, write with much less creative resistance. We feel more confident in social situations, that it seems to be helping with a lot of these things. So I think those are the two biggest factors driving it. And then the third one is one that we've already touched on, which is just a reevaluation of psychedelics as non-addictive, non-harmful substances. That prior to, Michael Pollan's book being published and all of this research coming out, people would perceive microdosing as being highly addictive, for example. But what we know is that even when people are taking these low doses of psychedelics, that you can microdose 2 or 3 times a week for 30 days, 60 days, and stop and you're not going to have any withdrawals whatsoever. And so I think there's also that larger cultural conversation of reevaluating previously illicit substances and recognizing that they, especially psychedelics, have incredible potential for us. And so it's really a sort of a perfect storm, if you will. I mean, just as an example of this, there's a subreddit that's dedicated to microdosing, and I believe it was started in 2016 or 2017. In 2018, it maybe had 20,000 subscribers. And now, I mean, I could check quick, but it probably has anywhere between 300,000 and 400,000 subscribers. Wow. So it's just growing exponentially. In fact, in the COVID-19 pandemic, if you look at statistics from 2019 to 2023, the number of people who took a psychedelic quadrupled.
Wow.
So 4 times the number of people who took a psychedelic in 2019 took it in 2023. And that was really dictated by microdosing, but also telemedicine ketamine, that you can now get prescribed ketamine off label, sent it to your house, and go through basically therapeutic ketamine sessions in the comfort of your own home. So there's a lot there, but I think those are probably the three biggest factors.
No, I think it's such an important, I think, thing for us to be able to wrap our heads around, right, is as we see the conversation shift, like, what has that meant for us? And like, both for things like access, to your point, that you can get telemedicine and have it delivered. But then these important ideas like that, we're kind of reevaluating these ideas too. And I think it's, what I'm curious about too with this is that there's this one little piece that's like sticking in my brain that I'm trying to think about. And, it's like a bit of, your own story. And I think many of our stories too. I grew up in Texas in a very similar household structure to the one that you described in your story. And one of these like kind of back and forth conversations is like, LSD doesn't really carry this, I don't know if it's baggage is the right term, but just this luggage, the same way that like we see a lot of plant medicines in terms of having a kind of spiritual, cultural component on some other side of it, right? And there seems to be some kind of a back and forth in folks' perspectives. I'm curious here of that, like, there's no requirement to have any spiritual side of any of these, right? But they could. And how do you kind of navigate that? I mean, does Third Wave, do you touch on that with folks? I mean, I know because also the certification program that you do is interesting, that you have the James Fadiman call out card that says it's a non-spiritual, non-medical approach to that. I think that was really interesting. So I'm curious your approach on how and when does spirituality come in or not to these conversations, and does that ever incorporate into your training at Third Wave or the certification program or not? And just curious how that works.
Yeah, we discuss spirituality in as much as a relationship helps us to benefit in a practical way. Meaning there's clear, tangible benefits from having a spiritual practice or spiritual awareness or spiritual connection to something greater, right? And this has been established not only through the clinical research on psychedelics, but also generally over the sort of span of history, right? It's no coincidence that when Nietzsche proclaimed that God was dead at the end of the 19th century, that he predicted as a result of that, this sort of mass apocalypse, World War I, World War II, nihilism, the loss of meaning, all these sorts of things. So, and, my personal story is somewhat indicative of that, I grew up in a religious household, Protestant. We went to a Reformed church. So it was pretty, dry in a way, quite Calvinist in a way. And so I never really got it, because it was just, we would say these prayers, we would sing these hymns, we would talk about how we believed in God and Jesus as the Son of God, and that would, save us and we go to heaven, but it never really clicked with me. I'm just like, I don't get it. And so by the age of 16, 17, 18, the same friend who introduced me to cannabis and psilocybin mushrooms, he was an atheist. And so he started introducing me to Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and, even Sam Harris, who's kind of an interesting mix of both spiritual and atheist perspective. And so I started to get pretty into the concept of atheism and reductionism and, science being the God, if you will. And then I started to do LSD soon after that. And then from a lot of those early experiences with high doses of LSD, I came to recognize and realize many things, probably most centrally that I felt deeply connected to everything around me, that the experience that I'd had on a high dose of LSD mapped with what a lot of these spiritual and mystical traditions talked about in terms of connection to source, connection to God, connection to the one, if you will. And so I think what we communicate at Third Wave, and what we even talk about in our training program, is having a spiritual practice, being aware of how psychedelics can catalyze, let's say, a spiritual emergency, if you will. And a spiritual emergency is more or less like a dark night of the soul, right? That there may be certain aspects or truths that we have to confront about our path or ourselves that are very uncomfortable, right? And so just knowing that this can be a very common experience with psychedelics, especially if you're a coach, a therapist, or facilitator, is so necessary, because that deep spiritual experience is going to have tangible impacts on the container that you've created with a client, right? And so that's more the framing. And then because of our emphasis on microdosing so much, when you microdose, you're not talking to God. You're not seeing, vibrant colors everywhere. You're not, tripping. You're tripping, basically. You're noticing a slight enhancement, in your everyday existence, but you're not tripping. And so again, what I'm really focused on is the sort of practical outcomes. So that if you're taking a low dose of LSD 2 times a week, how might that impact, your brain chemistry, or how might that impact your relationship with your partner or spouse? So I think always rooting in the practical and tangible is a great balance, because so oftentimes when people start to work with very high doses of psychedelics, the emphasis on the esoteric gets in the way of actual sort of tangible benefits in their everyday life.
I think that's a great point. And to kind of dig into that a little bit more too, this idea that, you do a lot of training, and what I appreciate also about mastering microdosing too is thinking about how this works for life in the workplace, kind of productivity for leadership, and this idea. And I think that's an important point, where it's like, if folks haven't tried microdosing, right, it's non-psychoactive, and it's like you're not tripping, to your point. You're not necessarily floating out in the clouds or wherever else you might go, or necessarily in the darkness of yourself. Sometimes, those can come up, as to your point, but they don't always have to. You have I guess some semblance more of control, I suppose, in terms of how your experience goes. So, but I'm curious, how this has worked in both like the reception and how you've kind of framed this, in terms of microdosing for helping leaders and other folks, kind of obtain either these, like, we've kind of talked about productivity and efficiency as parts of it, but then also I think the other interesting stories that you've shared too with that is that, like, feeling more pro-social, right? Feeling more comfortable in an environment you may not feel as comfortable with. If you have social anxiety, for example. So I'm curious, like the ideas, like, I think it's incredibly exciting to put leadership and microdosing in the same box and see what pops up. So tell me about how that, how that came to be, and how's it looking today?
Well, as you can imagine, there's, the first major talk I gave on this was at a conference called the Next Web in Amsterdam in 2017, right? And so this was pre-Michael Pollan. And from that talk, a lot of people were enthusiastic about it and loved it. But what I noticed is there were critique from two sides. One was the critique from people in typical business, corporate business, which is, why would I want to do an illegal drug? Why would I especially want to do something like psychedelics or LSD? Hippies do that, ravers do that. We don't do that necessarily. And so that was like one framing on it. And the other framing was from like the deep psychedelic crowd, which is, you can't just make, psychedelics and LSD another tool for the man. You're just helping capitalism get better, man. Like, that's not, it's not cool. And so the way that I think number one sort of has taken care of itself now, that because of all the momentum that we're seeing and the progress that we're seeing in the psychedelic landscape, creatives, leaders, people who are on the cutting edge of what it means to build a business are looking for tools and techniques that can help them do a better job. And so because psychedelics have become very much destigmatized, people will often start with microdoses, but that journey of starting with a microdose may lead them down into a deeper path of working with high doses of psychedelics. And typically people in quote unquote leadership positions experience what I would say 2 main benefits. One is the impact on neuroplasticity. So microdosing really helps to increase something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is a precursor to neuroplasticity. And anyone in a leadership position must be constantly adapting, learning, growing, developing new perspectives and a new lens for things. And microdosing can really help with that process of helping the brain become more plastic. And I'd say the second thing is courage. That as leaders, whether of businesses or our families or of our own lives, the more courage we have to make the difficult but necessary decisions, the better our life becomes. And so the impact that psychedelics have on the amygdala, which is the reptilian brain, sort of the fear response, where our fear response comes from, is it helps to down-regulate that fear response. And so all of a sudden, people in more leadership positions feel more courageous to make that difficult but necessary decision in their life. And I think that then relates to the second element that I talked about or critique, which is microdosing is just a way to make capitalists better at what they do. And kind of my typical response to that is capitalism, for better or worse, is the best system that we've come up with so far. Its utility is slowly waning. Like, we are in need of a new system, but currently in the present moment, it's helped a lot of people overall. A lot of people in business and leadership positions are reaching this point in time where they're looking to climb the second mountain of their career, of their vocation, that they've often climbed that first mountain of status, ego, and success. They did not find what they expected to find there, and they're really looking to pursue a vocation that is more in line with being connected to community, having a positive social impact, pursuing work that is meaningful and fulfilling. And while there's still a necessity of paying your bills, of making income, that isn't necessarily the driving force. And so what we find with a lot of these people who are in that liminal space, they know, X isn't working, but they're not quite sure how to get to Y. They look at psychedelics and microdosing as sort of a teacher or a tool or an ally to generate clarity in that process. And I think my sort of optimistic hope or ideal is that then the more we have people in positions of power and leadership who are being transformed through intentional psychedelic work, the more likely it is that we will build systems in economics, in politics, in education, in healthcare that are rooted in some of those deep and fundamental truths of what we experience with high doses of psychedelics, which is, and again, some of these are quite cliche, but they bear repeating. Love is the most powerful force in the world. We are interconnected to everything around us. There is no separation and there is no other. That's merely an illusion. And so how and in which ways can we build systems that are reflective of that? And so the sort of up and coming looking at, regeneration, a regenerative economy. Instead of treating individuals as a cog in a larger machine, we're really treating the individual as an individual in terms of what you need and how can I support you. So I think there's lots of ways in which psychedelics have, especially in the 50s and 60s, which would be a whole nother podcast episode, influenced the computer revolution and influenced the internet and influenced the development of decentralized ecosystems. But that was always counterculture. It was always very minor. And now what we're noticing is those kind of weird and wacky Buckminster Fuller ideas that became very prominent in the 60s, that became sort of known in certain circles in the 60s, are now becoming more prominent as a solution to address the meta crisis that we currently find ourselves in.
Oh, that's great. Because I think that's such an exciting point that, we're seeing both a shift of thought and like the countercultural ideas that we saw in the 60s, 70s, and even in the 50s a little bit, are entering conversations in ways that they had never done that before. Right? And I appreciate your point speaking to this tension that we hear, and this is common of, unsurprisingly, I think in anthropology and social science circles, of just this concern of that we don't want to get things just subsumed into the quote unquote, machine of capitalism in the sense that it's going to get then just become productized and then spit out as a mass consumer product. Meaning, in essence, that it loses any of its actual intrinsic value, right, of being what it is. And I think you're right, though, that there's something about the capacity of psychedelics, LSD and psilocybin and most of them, right, that even if one is to microdose only and have a purely this is just for enhancing productivity, there's still some door that slowly opens to the other point, right, that I know it's funny, it sounds cliche, but it's still there is something that happens, right, as people find themselves experiencing themselves or the world through psychedelics, that these things that sound cliche come through, that the love is the greatest force, right? And that we are all connected. And even people that take them laugh and say, yes, but Also, yes, we still feel that, like it's not like this. Okay, yeah, I know I'm gonna feel that and whatever. Now it's fake. It's like it's like kind of like you still know it more. And I think there's really an important power to that idea, right? That those bigger ideas of connectivity and love have not lost steam the more people that take it, right? And I think you're right too. We'll see that continuing to kind of increase. And it's one of those jokes that, you hear people say, how do we kind of fix the gridlock in Congress? It's like, we'll just pipe MDMA through the air conditioning system, during a session or something. But it's like, okay, I'm not advocating doing that, but just like
not recommended,
not recommended. But the joke of like, how do we kind of crack those hearts and those minds a little bit, right? In terms of like, let's just see what actually brings us together. And I think that's why what you're doing at Third Wave is also such an interesting space, where it's like microdosing is a great way to introduce the practice of psychedelics, but then also, again, like heavy doses are not for everybody, right? Not everybody needs to do it all the time. I think to your point, like the dentist metaphor is good, that every once in a while it's good to get a good cleaning. But it feels it's not scary to brush your teeth, for most of us. I think that's a really compelling way to kind of think about what that conversation can be as I enter into it. And especially obviously in like a leadership or creative or workplace context, right? You certainly cannot go to work, quote unquote, on drugs, but recognizing the power of being able to give yourself the space and intentional practice and these protocols, as you said too before, I think is really important, of like setting that setting and that intention for what you're trying to improve. And actually something else that I appreciated about the book too is that, the middle chunk of it is like how to set those intentions, or how to set what you want to get out of it. And so, because again, it's not just let me take it and see what happens. Like it's one of those, like, if you don't know where you're going, you're not going to get anywhere, or you're going to get exactly, which is nowhere. So the other side of that is like, we actually have to have that intention. So I want to hear a little bit about this too. And just to kind of, reiterate this point too, it's that like intention matters, right? It's not just about, let's go either get high or like, let's just take it and see what shows up. It's like those both miss the point, right?
Exactly. Yeah. You gotta, as you said, if you're getting on the bus, you gotta know more or less where it's headed, because what psychedelics do, and this is at both low doses and especially at high doses, is they disrupt the system. So there is entropy that's created. There's movement that's created. And if there's not a direction for that movement, it could take you way off course, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's why having a very safe set and setting, having a structured container for that experience, whether it's microdosing or a high dose, is very important, because it gives you sort of a line to follow, if you will, or a mantra to come back to. And so the most common intentions that people have with microdosing are typically to feel better or to perform better, are probably the two most common ones. I would say the third one is to relate better. So to feel better, to perform better, or to relate better, right? Those typically are the three most common outcomes. And those, of course, map onto what I was talking about before with psilocybin for SSRIs and LSD for cognitive enhancement and performance. And then having practices that allow us to revisit that intention, to remain accountable to that intention. And I think what's also relevant here is to not become unnecessarily attached to that intention. That it helps to have a direction, it helps to have a focus, it helps to know where you're going. And life is emergent, life is chaotic, life is unpredictable. So there may be things that come up or arise even in the middle of a microdosing protocol where you're like, now I'm shifting, now I'm adapting. Now actually the sort of intention behind this protocol is going elsewhere. And that's totally okay as well. And what people notice even with high doses, when they set an intention, they'll have this journey and they'll finish the journey and they're like, man, I had this intention and, like it didn't happen. I didn't get the aha that I wanted. And then as they start to talk about that experience, whether it's in the integration circle, they're sharing it with the group, or they're sharing it with a friend, what often happens is they actually start to see how that intention was contextualized within the broader experience, but it didn't come in the way they thought it would come. And I think that is also really important, to stay very open in that in the inquiry, rather than being so focused on, if I don't get this response, it was a failure. right? And so remaining open in our expectations, staying open into sort of curiosity and the question and inquiry can really help us to look at things from a broader lens and see how that intention may be playing out, even if it's not precisely in the way that we had expected it to play out.
And I think that's also such a key insight in how I think we could also do good work in helping leaders shift their thinking also, both as, through microdosing and coaching, but then just this idea too, because so much of the business world is like, I got my KPIs and my quarterly reports, and especially if I have investors, I need to get the ROI in return for them, and my P&L sheets lined up and blah, blah, blah. And so there can be this very kind of rigid form of thinking for good reason, right? Because you're trying to make sure that the economics and profit and product and customers all line up. But this interesting point to your point, that life also happens, it's emergent, right? And I think that microdosing kind of help unlock a little bit of that framework of thinking that as leaders, as creatives, and when we're, especially if we're leading a team, that we can both manage what we're aiming to have through our intentions of our work and our goals, but then also balancing when life goes a slightly different way, right? And realizing there could be opportunities in those changes also, right? It's kind of like I was with some friends. We were at Burning Man last year in 2023, and that was
nice.
When we had the great flood of Black Rock City. And it's one of these funny things that we had a number of folks that had gone for the first time, and it was one of the saying that we kept being like, well, it's not always the burn that you want, but it's the burn that you need, and similar, we've heard the same kind of conversations for different psychedelic journeys with folks too, right? That it's not always the trip that you're looking for or want, or it's not maybe not giving you the download you want, but it's giving you what you need by having you kind of approach something in that way. And so I'm curious your thoughts about that too, just in like as you approach with leaders also, is that a way that you explore that through coaching with them or something, kind of is that kind of openness to what is and what can become, even if it doesn't feel like the right kind of P&L light up or KPI or something like that.
Right, because we're conditioned to want the immediate thing, the immediate response, the immediate knowing. And so that reframing of expectation, even going into an experience or a ceremony, in terms of staying in the question and staying in the inquiry and being comfortable with the not knowing. Mm-hmm. There's this fantastic essay by Richard Rohr, who's a well-known priest and writer of essays, and he talks about the liminal space. That when we're going from who we once were to who we are becoming, we're often in this process of liminality of not knowing. And I think that's especially true for people in leadership positions who are looking to work with psychedelics. They're looking to work with psychedelics because they're in a situation, or they're in an environment, or they're at a point in time in their life where they're stuck, where things are not working as good as they used to, where they may be suffering or they may be struggling with certain challenges. And so that framing of it's okay to not know, it's okay to be uncertain, it's okay to be in the question, right? And looking at psychedelics as a facilitator of that can be very helpful. And the most important thing then within that framing is that they feel safe. That there can be a way in which if psychedelics are done in a loose container or a not safe container, that they can be traumatizing. There can be really bad experiences that happen. And I would categorize those as quite different than having a challenging experience that allows for growth and development. So I think the larger frame here is safety is key. The ability to surrender is key. The ability to let go of always needing to be on and sort of type A is key for leaders. And what matters most is that they feel safe in whichever setting they may be doing, whether it's a one-on-one with, a facilitator we've trained, whether it's at a retreat in Costa Rica, whatever that might be. That key of being able to let go, surrender, is essential to opening up that process of inquiry and that question of what's next and being okay with not knowing.
Awesome. No, I think that's such an important point too. Because so much of this too is like letting go of the steering wheel a little bit in terms of saying I'm not totally in control. And I think that's also why having coach community facilitators is also such an important part of it. Mentors. It's not just let me go run out in the woods by myself. You could do that, I guess, but like you're going to get a lot more from most experiences when you have someone else that knows a bit more about the experience from you and to can kind of guide you through that. So I just want to say why I really appreciate the work that you're doing with Third Wave in the coaching programs and mastering microdosing. I'm excited for folks to check out that book as well. So just kind of as a wrap up question as we head out, either like, what are you most excited about? I think we've been talking about a lot of like both the microdosing and psychedelic space, but also just these like big cultural shifts that are happening. Like, where do you think we're going in the next 5 to 10 years, recreationally, legally, professionally, around the psychedelic and microdosing space?
Yeah, so Colorado and Oregon have both legalized psilocybin as states, which is fantastic. I'm actually on Wednesday going to a lobby day in Sacramento to talk with the governor's office and legislators in California to look at how we can get a similar bill passed this year in California. MDMA will be approved by the FDA this year to treat PTSD. So by the end of 2024, MDMA will it's very, very likely that it will be available through prescription to treat PTSD. Australia has already legalized psilocybin and MDMA for medical conditions. So we're seeing this kind of continued growth of interest in navigating and working with psychedelics. And there are a bunch of other states that also have ballots that are alive or going to the legislature or whatever it is. So my prediction is that by the end of this decade, 2030, the majority of Americans will have legal access to psychedelic substances, MDMA, psilocybin, even something like ayahuasca or San Pedro. And that will also be true for much of Europe. And the sort of further prediction beyond that, and what I'm most inspired by and excited about, is I've been building in the psychedelic space for almost 10 years now, media through Third Wave, high dose retreats through a company called Synthesis that I started, and then now training coaches and practitioners through the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. And I think the two big emerging opportunities will be microdosing supplements, more or less, that become more accessible and available, not necessarily through a typical dispensary model, but also not necessarily through a model that is currently implemented in Oregon where you have to be with a therapist in person to receive the substance. We're looking for like what is a middle way between those two. And then for me, I'm also really interested in land projects and real estate. And I did a Vipassana about 6 months ago, my first Vipassana, the 10-day silent meditation retreat. And I was really inspired by the story of Goenka and how he started those Vipassanas. And for anyone who doesn't know, it's totally free to attend. Everyone works on a volunteer basis. There's over 150 centers around the world, and over 100,000 people go through those centers every year through this 10-day Vipassana technique. And so I'm really inspired by how could we create a similar model, but for psilocybin mushrooms? What would a global church model look like, secular in nature, but still holding and supporting people as they're going through this experience to ensure that this medicine is used in a safe and responsible container with trained facilitators in a way that's accessible to anyone who wants to do it. And so for me, that's like what I plan to spend my next 30 or 40 years figuring out and hopefully building out, because I think it is essential that this medicine remain in the hands of those who need it most, that accessibility has to be central to this overall third wave of psychedelics, and that a nonprofit model in the long term is ideal because it incentivizes healing and transformation rather than profits and kind of all that other stuff that comes with a for-profit company.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Okay, so if you need some volunteers, let me know. That sounds right on, because I think that's beautiful. Yeah. Cool. Well, Paul, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the pod today. This has been a great convo. Definitely down for a sequel as we can talk real estate and spaces for that. But yeah, thanks for all the good work you're doing, and I'm excited to get the book in the hands of the audience, and we'll pass out any good word. But thanks for joining.
Thank you, Adam. This was a ton of fun. Thanks for having me on.
As we wrap up this fascinating conversation with Paul F. Austin on the evolving landscape of psychedelics, microdosing, and their transformative power, it's clear that we're on the cusp of a new era. It's an era where old taboos are being shattered and new paradigms of healing, creativity, and leadership emerge, rooted in ancient wisdom and cutting-edge science. Paul's journey from a traditional Midwestern upbringing to becoming a vanguard in the psychedelic renaissance underscores a universal quest for deeper understanding, connection, and enlightenment. It's a testament to the power of personal transformation to inspire collective change. And I want to give a huge thanks to Paul for joining me on the podcast today, for sharing his experiences, expertise, and stories. And of course, this isn't just a story about psychedelics. It's a narrative that's woven into the threads of hope and curiosity in a relentless pursuit of what it means to live a full, conscious life in the modern world. It invites us to question, to explore, and to open ourselves to possibilities that we once deemed perhaps unimaginable. And whether it's through the pages of Mastering Microdosing or the frontiers of our own uncharted experiences, the invitation is clear, I think. Let's look within, let's embrace the unknown, and discover the boundless potential that lies in the marriage of science, spirituality, and self-discovery. And if you're intrigued to dive deeper into Paul's insights and explorations, Mastering Microdosing, Paul's new book, awaits you at the TAL bookstore. Grab your copy, linked in our show notes below, and you can support independent bookstores, this podcast, and the authors. So it's a win-win-win. So until next time, keep pushing the boundaries, stay curious, and remember, the journey inward is the greatest adventure of all. This is Adam Gamwell for This Anthro Life. Thanks for tuning in.